In the early 16th century, the clash between two worlds produced one of the most astonishing encounters in human history. On one side stood the Incas, rulers of a vast and sophisticated empire in South America, with tens of thousands of warriors and centuries of tradition and infrastructure to their name. On the other side stood a mere 800 Spaniards, hardened adventurers known as conquistadors, armed with steel, horses, cannons, and a relentless hunger for wealth and glory. The meeting between these two vastly different powers in November 1532 at Cajamarca, Peru, culminated in an event so improbable and shocking that it still baffles historians today: the capture of Atahualpa, the mighty emperor of the Incas, by a tiny European force outnumbered 50-1. The story begins with the long trek of Francisco Pizarro and his men across some of the harshest landscapes on earth. Pizarro was not a nobleman of Spain but a poor swineherd who had risen through ambition, cunning, and sheer audacity. Having heard tales of vast riches lying in the lands beyond Panama, he set his sights on Peru, where rumors spoke of an empire rich in gold, silver, and powerful kings. With only a handful of men, he braved the jungles, high mountains, and unknown coasts to reach this fabled land. By 1532, Pizarro had finally brought a force of 168 men into the highlands of the Andes, though later reinforcements brought the number closer to 800. Still, compared to the might of the Inca Empire, which stretched across modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Colombia, the Spanish presence was like a spark threatening a forest fire. The Incas themselves were in turmoil at this time. Their emperor, Huayna Capac, had recently died, likely of a European disease such as smallpox that had spread ahead of the conquistadors. His death triggered a bloody civil war between his sons Atahualpa and Huáscar, each of whom claimed the throne. After years of brutal fighting, Atahualpa emerged victorious, capturing his brother and executing many of Huáscar's supporters. By the time Pizarro arrived, Atahualpa was celebrating his triumph and consolidating his power. This moment of instability provided the Spaniards with the perfect opportunity to exploit divisions within the empire. When Pizarro and his men entered Inca territory, they marveled at its sophistication. The roads were paved and stretched for thousands of miles, supply depots were organized, and messengers could relay information across the empire with astonishing speed. Yet for all their organization, the Incas had never seen horses, steel swords, or firearms. Their weapons were formidable in massed ranks: clubs, slings, spears, and bronze weapons, but they lacked the lethality and shock value of European technology. More importantly, the Incas did not fully understand the mindset of the Spaniards, who came not as traders or diplomats but as ruthless conquerors seeking domination at any cost. At Cajamarca, Pizarro devised a daring plan that bordered on madness. His small force faced Atahualpa's army of more than 40,000 warriors camped nearby. The Inca emperor, confident in his overwhelming numbers and the sacred aura of his rule, did not consider the Spaniards a threat. Instead of attacking them outright, he agreed to meet Pizarro in the town square of Cajamarca. For the conquistadors, this was both an opportunity and a death sentence. Surrounded by tens of thousands, they had only one chance: to strike first with shock and terror. On November 16, 1532, Atahualpa entered Cajamarca with several thousand of his retainers, leaving his main army outside the town. He was carried on a golden litter, surrounded by attendants and priests, dressed in brilliant finery that symbolized his divine status. The Spaniards had hidden themselves in buildings around the square, their cannons and cavalry ready to spring into action. As Atahualpa arrived, a Spanish friar named Vicente de Valverde stepped forward to deliver a message. He offered Atahualpa a Bible, urging him to accept Christianity and recognize the authority of King Charles of Spain. Atahualpa, confused by the object and angered by the arrogance of the foreigners, threw the book to the ground. This gesture was the spark Pizarro had been waiting for. At Pizarro's signal, cannons roared, muskets fired, and horsemen charged into the square. The noise alone was unlike anything the Incas had ever heard. Warhorses, clad in armor, thundered across the plaza, cutting down unarmed attendants with steel blades. The cannons tore through tightly packed crowds, while muskets sent smoke and death into the air. Panic erupted as the Incas realized they had walked into a trap. The sheer shock of the noise, the bloodshed, and the sight of men riding beasts they could barely comprehend shattered their discipline. Thousands tried to flee, but the narrow exits of the square created chaos and carnage. Amid the slaughter, the Spaniards pushed toward the golden litter of Atahualpa. The Inca nobles carrying him were cut down one by one, yet they refused to let the emperor touch the ground, lifting the litter higher even as they died. Finally, Pizarro himself seized Atahualpa, dragging him down and securing him as a prisoner. The unimaginable had occurred. With fewer than 1,000 men, the Spaniards had captured the ruler of an empire of millions. The battle was a massacre. While Spanish casualties were negligible, thousands of Incas lay dead in the square and surrounding streets. The shock reverberated across the empire. How could the child of the sun, the divine ruler of the Incas, be held by strangers from across the sea? The psychological blow was greater than any military defeat, for it struck at the very foundations of Inca belief. The Spaniards, meanwhile, were intoxicated by their triumph. They had captured not just a man but the living symbol of the empire, and with him, the fate of an entire civilization. Atahualpa, realizing the precariousness of his position, sought to bargain for his freedom. In one of the most famous episodes in history, he offered to fill a room with gold and 2 more with silver in exchange for release. For months, the Incas worked tirelessly, stripping temples, palaces, and treasuries to meet the ransom. The Spaniards watched in awe as wealth beyond imagination poured into Cajamarca. It is said that the treasure collected would have been enough to change the economy of Europe. Yet greed and fear outweighed any promises. Once the ransom was paid, the Spaniards, fearing that Atahualpa might rally his people against them if released, conducted a sham trial, accusing him of treason and idolatry. On July 26, 1533, Atahualpa was executed, strangled by a garrote after agreeing to be baptized to avoid burning at the stake. The capture and death of Atahualpa marked the beginning of the end for the Inca Empire. Though resistance continued for decades, the heart of the empire had been torn out. Spanish forces marched on Cuzco, the Inca capital, and seized it with relative ease. The combination of superior weapons, devastating diseases, internal divisions, and ruthless tactics ensured Spanish dominance. In less than a decade, one of the most remarkable civilizations in history had been brought to its knees by a few hundred adventurers driven by greed and faith. What makes the story of Cajamarca so enduring is not only its dramatic imbalance of numbers but also what it reveals about the encounter of 2 worlds. The Incas, for all their organizational brilliance and martial power, had never faced an enemy like the Spaniards, who blended technology, ferocity, and cunning deception. The Spaniards, in turn, exploited every weakness they could find, from civil wars to religious differences, turning chaos into opportunity. The capture of Atahualpa stands as one of the most audacious gambles in military history, a reminder that wars are not always won by numbers but often by strategy, shock, and the collapse of belief. Even centuries later, scholars debate whether events could have unfolded differently. If Atahualpa had attacked immediately with his full army, the Spaniards might have been wiped out in an afternoon. If the Incas had recognized the importance of horses and firearms sooner, they might have adapted their tactics. Yet history is shaped by moments of hesitation, by the choices of leaders, and by the weight of belief. Atahualpa's faith in his divine invincibility and his underestimation of the Spaniards sealed his fate and the fate of his people. The tragedy of the Incas also lies in the cultural devastation that followed. Temples were plundered, sacred objects melted down, and traditions suppressed. Yet traces of the Inca world survive in the language of Quechua, in the terraces that still cling to Andean mountainsides, and in the stories of resilience passed down by descendants. The capture of Atahualpa was not just a battle but a collision of civilizations, one that forever altered the course of the Americas. Looking back, the events of Cajamarca stand as both a triumph of daring and a cautionary tale of conquest. For the Spaniards, it was a dazzling victory that enriched them beyond their wildest dreams. For the Incas, it was the beginning of an age of suffering and transformation. For the world, it was a moment when 2 vastly different peoples met and reshaped history in blood and gold. The image of 800 conquistadors seizing an emperor from the grasp of 40,000 warriors remains one of the most startling episodes of the past, a reminder of how quickly power can shift, how fragile even the mightiest empires can be, and how the destinies of entire civilizations can hinge on a single day. Background of Francisco Pizarro and the Conquistadors. Francisco Pizarro was not born into nobility or privilege. He came from humble origins in Spain, the illegitimate son of a poor soldier and destined for obscurity had it not been for his iron will and ambition. When news of the New World's riches began to circulate, Pizarro saw an opportunity to change his fate. Inspired by Hernán Cortés's conquest of the Aztecs in Mexico, Pizarro believed a similar empire awaited discovery in the lands further south. He was joined by other hardened adventurers, men who were not knights but opportunists hungry for gold, land, and power. These were the conquistadors, individuals whose lives revolved around taking risks in unknown territories for unimaginable rewards. They were armed with steel swords, firearms, crossbows, and cavalry, tools of warfare that would soon prove decisive in the Andes. Driven by the promise of wealth and eternal glory in the name of Spain and Christianity, they embarked on a perilous expedition into unknown lands. Their ambitions far outweighed their numbers, for with only a few hundred men they dared to challenge an empire of millions. This boldness set the stage for one of the most improbable encounters in history. The Inca Empire's power and organization. The Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. It stretched across vast territories, covering present-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, parts of Chile, and Colombia. Despite the challenges of the rugged Andean terrain, the Incas built a sophisticated system of governance and infrastructure. Their roads extended for thousands of miles, allowing armies and messengers to move swiftly. Storehouses ensured food security, and local administrators maintained strict control over populations. Militarily, the Incas could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors, organized into disciplined units armed with slings, spears, clubs, and bronze weapons. While they lacked steel and gunpowder, their sheer numbers and coordination gave them formidable strength. Religion reinforced their authority, with the emperor, or Sapa Inca, regarded as the divine child of the sun. This fusion of political and spiritual power made loyalty to the emperor absolute. To the outside observer, the empire appeared unshakable, a colossus of wealth and manpower. Yet its vast size and reliance on centralized authority also created vulnerabilities. As the Spaniards approached, the Inca Empire was at the height of its power, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming that would be ruthlessly exploited. Civil war between Atahualpa and Huáscar. The death of Huayna Capac, the Inca emperor, unleashed chaos in the empire. Likely a victim of smallpox introduced by Europeans, his sudden passing left two rival sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar, competing for the throne. What followed was a brutal civil war that tore through the heart of the empire. Huáscar, based in the capital Cuzco, claimed legitimacy as the traditional heir. Atahualpa, ruling from Quito in the north, commanded a powerful army of seasoned generals and loyal factions. Years of bloodshed ensued, weakening the empire's cohesion and morale. Villages were devastated, and divisions deepened among nobles and warriors. By the time the Spaniards arrived in 1532, Atahualpa had emerged victorious. His forces crushed Huáscar's army, captured him, and slaughtered many of his supporters. Though Atahualpa now stood as the undisputed ruler, the empire was weary from civil conflict. Factions loyal to Huáscar still simmered with resentment, and the unity of the realm was fragile. This moment of instability proved critical, for the Spaniards were quick to exploit division. They presented themselves not only as conquerors but also as opportunists who could manipulate rivalries. Without the civil war, the Spaniards' audacious gamble might never have succeeded. The arrival of Pizarro in Peru. Francisco Pizarro's march into Peru was an odyssey of hardship and audacity. With barely 200 men at first, he ventured into one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. His men endured freezing nights in the high Andes, sweltering days in valleys, and the constant threat of ambush from hostile tribes. They had no secure supply lines, no reinforcements from Spain, and survival often depended on seizing local food stores. Yet despite these challenges, Pizarro pressed forward, fueled by the lure of Inca gold. His soldiers were hardened veterans of wars in Europe and the Caribbean, accustomed to long odds and desperate struggles. Their discipline and small unit cohesion gave them an edge, even against overwhelming numbers. By 1532, reinforcements had swelled their ranks to nearly 800, still a fraction compared to the Inca armies. As they advanced, they were astonished by the wealth and sophistication of Inca cities, stone buildings without mortar, terraces clinging to mountainsides, and storehouses brimming with goods. For the Spaniards, this confirmed the rumors of immense riches. For the Incas, the arrival of these strange, bearded men with beasts and thunderous weapons was a curiosity rather than a threat, an underestimation that would cost them dearly. The first contact between Spaniards and Incas. When Pizarro's force first encountered the Incas, both sides were cautious but intrigued. To the Spaniards, the Inca people appeared well disciplined, industrious, and respectful of authority. To the Incas, the Spaniards seemed otherworldly, riding horses that appeared like mythical creatures, wearing gleaming armor, and carrying weapons that boomed like thunder. Atahualpa, confident after his victory in the Civil War, did not regard the Spaniards as dangerous. With 40,000 warriors at his disposal, he saw no reason to fear fewer than 1,000 foreigners. He treated them more as emissaries than invaders, allowing them safe passage rather than crushing them immediately. The Spaniards, on the other hand, saw opportunity in this hesitation. They sent messengers offering friendship but demanding submission to the Spanish king and the Christian faith. Atahualpa listened with polite disdain. In his eyes, he was the son of the sun, supreme above all others, and these ragged foreigners had no claim to authority over him. Still, he agreed to meet them at Cajamarca, perhaps to impress them with his grandeur or to assess their intentions. This mutual underestimation set the stage for the confrontation that would change history forever. Pizarro's bold plan at Cajamarca. Faced with Atahualpa's immense army encamped outside Cajamarca, Pizarro knew a conventional battle meant certain destruction. Outnumbered more than 50 to 1, the Spaniards had only one chance: to strike with surprise and psychological terror. In an audacious gamble, Pizarro proposed to lure Atahualpa into the town square with a small entourage, then ambush him. His men would hide in surrounding buildings, with cannons and cavalry ready to erupt at a signal. The plan was breathtakingly risky. If the Incas resisted effectively, the Spaniards would be annihilated in moments. Yet Pizarro understood that the Incas revered Atahualpa as a living god. If the emperor could be captured, the entire empire might collapse into confusion. His men were anxious, some doubting the madness of attacking tens of thousands with a mere handful, but Pizarro's resolve never wavered. He reminded them of Cortez's triumph in Mexico and promised wealth beyond imagination. Driven by faith, greed, and desperation, they prepared for the most daring ambush in history. As the sun set on November 15, 1532, the Spaniards prayed and sharpened their weapons, knowing that by the next evening they would either be dead or masters of an empire. Atahualpa's entrance into Cajamarca. On November 16, 1532, Atahualpa entered Cajamarca with the majesty befitting a divine emperor. Carried on a litter of gold, adorned with jewels and fine garments, he was surrounded by attendants, nobles, and priests. Thousands of unarmed retainers marched with him, chanting and playing instruments, filling the square with a spectacle of imperial splendor. Yet his main army of 40,000 remained camped outside the town, as Atahualpa saw no need to overwhelm the Spaniards with force. To him, the meeting was not a battle but a demonstration of superiority. The Spaniards, hidden in ambush, watched in awe and tension as the procession filled the plaza. The contrast could not have been greater. A handful of armored Europeans with muskets and cannons concealed in shadows, awaiting their moment, and the radiant emperor of the Andes paraded like a sun god in front of his people. The atmosphere was electric, the calm before the storm. Atahualpa, unaware of the danger, basked in the adoration of his followers, confident that no small band of foreigners could challenge the might of the Inca Empire. In this overconfidence lay the seeds of his downfall. The friar and the Bible incident. As Atahualpa settled in the square, a Dominican friar named Vicente de Valverde approached him carrying a cross and a Bible. Speaking through an interpreter, the friar declared that Atahualpa must accept Christianity and acknowledge King Charles of Spain as his sovereign. For the Spaniards, this was both a religious mission and a justification for conquest. For Atahualpa, it was an insult. He was the Sapa Inca, child of the sun, ruler of millions. To be told to submit to a distant king and a foreign god was absurd. He took the Bible, examined it curiously, and then, baffled that it made no sound or spoke no words, threw it to the ground. To the Spaniards, this was blasphemy, an outrage that demanded divine retribution. To Atahualpa, it was a dismissal of an object without meaning. But that simple gesture became the pretext Pizarro needed. He raised his hand, the signal for the ambush to begin. Cannons fired, muskets boomed, and the sound of horses' hooves thundered across the square. In a heartbeat, the peaceful meeting became a blood-soaked trap. The ambush and Spanish attack. The ambush unfolded with devastating effect. Hidden cannons fired into the tightly packed crowd, sending shockwaves of sound and carnage through the plaza. Muskets roared, filling the air with smoke, confusion, and death. Then, like thunderbolts, the Spanish cavalry charged. To the Incas, who had never seen horses before, it was as if monsters of iron and flesh had descended upon them. The Spaniards wielded steel swords and lances, cutting down attendants and warriors alike. The panic was overwhelming. The Incas, unarmed for this ceremonial occasion, had no chance to organize resistance. The exits of the square became bottlenecks, trapping thousands as they tried desperately to flee. Many were trampled to death in the chaos. The Spaniards, though vastly outnumbered, used terror, shock, and their superior weapons to devastating effect. The clash of steel, the screams of the dying, and the thunder of gunpowder created a nightmare that shattered Inca confidence. What began as a display of imperial grandeur turned into one of the most lopsided massacres in history, and at its center, the Spaniards pushed toward their ultimate prize, the emperor himself. The capture of Atahualpa. Amid the slaughter, the Spaniards focused on Atahualpa. His golden litter, carried by loyal nobles, stood high above the chaos. The attendants, armed only with courage, tried desperately to protect their ruler. Even as they were cut down one by one, they lifted the litter higher, refusing to let the divine emperor fall. The devotion was extraordinary, but steel and horsemen could not be stopped. Pizarro himself fought his way through the blood and smoke to seize Atahualpa. In the struggle, he ordered his men to capture him alive, knowing the emperor was the key to controlling the empire. Finally, Atahualpa was dragged from his litter, the symbol of his godlike status destroyed in an instant. The effect was catastrophic. To the Inca warriors, the unimaginable had happened. The child of the sun, the embodiment of their empire, had been taken by foreigners. The psychological blow was immense. Without their divine ruler to lead them, panic spread like wildfire. In a single night, the Spaniards had accomplished the impossible. They had seized the most powerful man in the Andes, and with him, the fate of an entire civilization. Psychological impact on the Inca army. The capture of Atahualpa sent shockwaves through the Inca ranks. Warriors who moments earlier stood confident in their numbers now found themselves paralyzed by fear and disbelief. The emperor was not just a king but a divine figure, believed to be descended from the sun itself. His capture shattered the spiritual and psychological foundation of Inca power. Many warriors fled in chaos, convinced that supernatural forces had turned against them. Others froze, unwilling to fight without the presence and command of their leader. For the Spaniards, this collapse of morale was their greatest weapon. Their physical victory in the square was dwarfed by the psychological triumph of seizing the emperor. The Incas still vastly outnumbered the Spaniards, and their armies camped outside Cajamarca could have easily destroyed the foreigners. Yet the shock and confusion prevented decisive action. Instead of uniting against the small band of invaders, many nobles hesitated, unsure of what to do without their godlike ruler. This hesitation gave Pizarro time to consolidate his position, turning a desperate gamble into a turning point in world history. Atahualpa's ransom offer. Once a prisoner, Atahualpa realized that the Spaniards valued gold and silver above all else. In a bid to secure his release, he made an extraordinary offer. He would fill a room with gold and 2 others with silver, up to the height of his outstretched hand, if the Spaniards would set him free. The conquistadors were astonished. They agreed, and Atahualpa ordered his subjects to deliver treasure from across the empire. Over the following months, caravans brought ornaments, vessels, and sacred objects from temples and palaces. The wealth was beyond anything the Europeans had ever seen. Gold was melted down into bars, stripping away centuries of artistry and religious meaning. For the Incas, it was a desperate attempt to save their emperor. For the Spaniards, it was the fulfillment of dreams of limitless riches. The ransom collected was so vast it would have transformed the economy of Spain. Yet once it was paid, Atahualpa's fate remained uncertain. Pizarro and his men, greedy and fearful, began to doubt whether releasing the emperor would undermine their fragile control. Suspicion grew that Atahualpa was plotting against them, and soon betrayal would follow. Spanish betrayal and execution of Atahualpa. Despite fulfilling his ransom promise, Atahualpa was not released. The Spaniards feared that if he were freed, he would rally the empire's vast armies against them. To justify his execution, they staged a sham trial, accusing him of idolatry, polygamy, treason, and plotting rebellion. The verdict was predetermined: death. Initially, he was sentenced to be burned at the stake, a fate that horrified him since fire would prevent his body from being preserved for the afterlife according to Inca beliefs. A friar offered him baptism into Christianity in exchange for a less brutal death. Atahualpa agreed and was baptized with the name Francisco. On July 26, 1533, he was strangled with a garrote, his life extinguished at the hands of men who had sworn to spare him. His execution was not only a betrayal but also a profound shock to his people. With the emperor gone, the symbolic heart of the Inca Empire was destroyed. For the Spaniards, it was the removal of their greatest threat. For the Incas, it was the beginning of an age of despair, conquest, and cultural destruction that would reshape their world forever. The fall of the Inca Empire. With Atahualpa dead, the Spaniards moved swiftly to consolidate their control. They marched on Cuzco, the imperial capital, and occupied it with relative ease. The absence of a unifying emperor, the devastation of civil war, and the shock of Atahualpa's death left the empire leaderless and fractured. Some Inca nobles allied with the Spaniards to protect their own positions, while others resisted but without coordination or centralized command. Over the following years, Spanish forces continued their advance, crushing resistance and establishing colonial rule. Disease, already spreading through the empire, decimated the population, reducing the Incas' ability to fight back. The once mighty Tawantinsuyu crumbled within a decade. Although pockets of resistance persisted, including the establishment of the Neo-Inca state. At Vilcabamba, the empire as it had been was gone. Spanish cities replaced Inca centers, churches rose over temples, and European systems of governance were imposed. What had been one of the most powerful empires in the world collapsed before fewer than 1,000 Europeans. The fall of the Inca Empire stands as one of the most dramatic and tragic transformations in human history, altering the destiny of South America forever. Legacy of Cajamarca. The encounter at Cajamarca remains one of the most astonishing episodes in history. How could 800 Spaniards defeat and capture an emperor guarded by 40,000 warriors? The answer lies not only in steel, horses, and gunpowder but also in psychology, strategy, and cultural misunderstanding. The Incas, confident in their divine ruler, underestimated the ruthless ambition of the Spaniards. Pizarro and his men exploited every advantage, from surprise to terror, turning their small numbers into overwhelming force. The capture of Atahualpa was not just a battle but a symbolic blow that shattered the empire's spirit. Its legacy is complex. For Spain, it meant immense wealth and global power. For the Incas, it marked the beginning of conquest, oppression, and cultural loss. Yet the Inca legacy endures in language, traditions, and descendants who still live in the Andes. Cajamarca is remembered both as a triumph of daring and as a tragedy of conquest. It is a reminder that empires, no matter how vast, can collapse in a moment of overconfidence and hesitation. It is also a lesson about the power of audacity, the fragility of civilizations, and the enduring consequences when two worlds collide.